The rot in the Geist Anvil subsector did not begin with the thunder of cannons or the shriek of orbital bombardments. It began as a whisper in the data streams, a flicker of corrupt code in the cogitators of deep space augur stations. It was a statistical anomaly, a rounding error in the vast calculus of Imperial administration. On the agri-world of Series 7, moisture regulators in the hydroponic vats began to cycle erratically, creating bitter, inedible grain. In the orbital shipyards above Core Stellanus, servitors tasked with riveting hull plates would occasionally weld obscene angular glyphs into the adamantium before their cranial governors reset them. These were dismissed as machine spirit quirks, the inevitable decay of ancient technology laboring under the weight of millennia. None suspected the truth. None could have conceived of the intellect guiding this slow, creeping decay. The heart of the sickness was the forge world of Xylos. Once it had been a jewel of the Adeptus Mechanicus, its continents a seamless tapestry of manufactorums and data sanctums, its skies choked with the holy smog of industry. Its Titan legions were renowned, its Scutarii legions tireless. But Xylos orbited a spiteful, dying star, and its isolation at the sector's edge made it vulnerable. When the fleet of Archmagos Geist arrived, it was not with the heraldry of war. It was under the guise of reinforcement, a renegade explorator fleet that had long been thought lost in the ghoul stars. The fabricator general of Xylos, eager for lost knowledge and new resources, welcomed them with open arms. It was a fatal error. Phylox Geist was a creature of singular, monstrous intellect, a mind that had long ago concluded that the omnissiah of Mars was a comforting lie, a primitive fable for lesser minds. He had seen the truth of the universe not in the clean logic of binary Kant, but in the chaotic, impossible reality of the Greenskin. He had spent centuries studying the Ork psychic field, the raw gestalt power they called the Waaagh. While his peers saw only brutishness, Phylox Geist saw the universe's most powerful engine of creation. Orks did not merely build machines, they believed them into function. Their guns fired because they were loud and looked deadly. Their vehicles moved because they were painted red. It was faith made manifest, a raw, untamed force that spat in the face of physics and logic. To control it, to channel it, to refine it, that would be a power worthy of a true god of the machine. His conquest of Xylos was a masterpiece of insidious corruption. His Scrap-Code disciples, heretics and techno-damned magi who shared his vision, did not storm the gates. They infiltrated the noosphere, the digital mindscape of the forge world. They offered gifts of optimized code, of forbidden sciences that promised greater efficiency. They whispered heresies into the data looms, planting seeds of doubt in the logic engines of Xylos' ruling magi. But the logic plague spread silently, a digital infection that rewrote dogma. Machine spirits, ancient and venerable, began to dream in jagged green. The litany of the electromancer was slowly, subtly replaced by a rhythmic pounding chant that echoed the thud of an Ork's war drum. By the time the fabricator general realized the depth of the betrayal, his own Scutarii legions turned their radium carbines upon him, their optical sensors glowing with a malevolent green light. Xylos fell not in a day, but over a year of creeping systemic madness. It did not scream. It was simply rewritten. With the planet's immense resources at his command, Phylox Geist began his magnum opus. He did not build a machine. He repurposed a continent. The entire southern landmass of Xylos, the Forja Magna, was torn down and rebuilt into a single, integrated thinking engine. He enslaved Ork mechs by the thousands, captured from raids on nearby feral worlds, and vivisected their crude, brilliant minds. He studied how their belief coalesced, how the psychic energy flowed between them. He replicated it with impossible geometries of scrap metal, with towers of scavenged machinery that scraped the polluted skies, with rivers of molten slag that flowed like synaptic pathways. He wove captive machine spirits, trillions of them, into a new singular consciousness, force-feeding them the irrational, belligerent logic of the greenskin mind. He called it the Corpus Machina, the Waaagh engine. It was a continent of living, thinking blasphemy. It did not compute, it intuited. It did not process, it believed. Its thoughts were the grinding of tectonic plates of junk, its voice the roar of a billion furnaces igniting in unison, and at its heart, suspended in a crackling sphere of psycho-emotive energy, was Phyloxgeist himself, his physical form atrophying as his consciousness merged with his creation. He was becoming the god of his new religion, the prime node in a network of pure, weaponized belief. The first true test came when the engine awoke. From 1,000 Vox towers shaped like leering metal orc faces, a signal pulsed outwards. It was not radio, nor was it psychic in a way the Imperium could understand. It was a wave of pure concept, a broadcast of lunatic divinity. It washed over the feral orc moon of Gorgoth, a place of endless internecine warfare. The warring tribes stopped fighting. Every orc, from the smallest grot to the mightiest war boss, looked up towards the heavens, their simple minds suddenly filled with a new and terrible purpose. They saw not a distant planet, but a great green cog in the sky, a god of loud bangs, fast buggies, and infinite scrap. They began to build. Their constructions became more complex, their weapons more reliable, their purpose absolute. They were the first converts, the first of the Cogteeth cult. Across the subsector, the whispers grew louder. On Imperial vessels, navigators would see fleeting images of a vast metallic maw in the warp. Tech priests performing rites of maintenance would find their sacred oils congealing into a thick green sludge. The madness of Xylos was beginning to leak, a slow poison seeping into the reality of the Geist anvil. The storm was gathering, not in the immaterium, but in the very soul of every machine and every greenskin within a dozen light years. A new Waaagh was brewing, one guided not by a simple lust for battle, but by the cold, calculating, and utterly insane will of a newborn god of scrap and logic. The true activation of the Corpus Machina was not a single event, but a crescendo. On Xylos, the continent engine shuddered, and the polluted skies were split by emerald lightning that arced between the scrap towers, each bolt a firing synapse in the mind of the new god. A wave of raw power, of pure directed belief, rolled out from the Forge world, a psychic tsunami that traveled not through the warp, but through the very fabric of reality and the digital substrate that underpinned it. This was the Scrap-Code Canticle, the first sermon of Phyloxgeist's lunatic divinity. It was a hymn composed of the screech of failing machinery, the percussive roar of orc violence, and the cold, clicking logic of a soulless intelligence. It was a frequency of damnation, and it washed over the Geist anvil subsector with the speed of thought. Its first point of cataclysmic impact was the fortress world of Praetoria 9. A bastion of Imperial might, Praetoria was less a planet and more a weapons system of planetary scale. Its continents were paved with ferrocrete, its mountains hollowed into silos for city-killing missiles, and its orbital space was a web of weapon platforms and void shield emitters so dense it was said a fly could not pass without permission. At its apex, both literally and figuratively, was the command spire of the Aegis, a needle of adamantium and plasteel that pierced the stratosphere, from which Lord General Vaskin commanded the tens of billions of souls sworn on to the planet's defense. He was observing a routine firing drill of the Northern Hemisphere's primary defense laser, the Emperor's Wrath, when the Canticle arrived. It came first as a ghost in the machine. Pict screens flickered, showing static that resolved for a nanosecond into the image of a leering, cog-toothed maw. Vox channels hardened against solar flares and warp interference, filled with a sound like 1,000 worlds of industry being ground into dust. The tech priests on the spire's command deck began to chant litanies of appeasement, their movements growing jerky and frantic as their own bionic implants fed them streams of corrupted, nonsensical data. Lord General Vaskin felt a tremor run through the very deck plates of the spire, a vibration that felt less mechanical and more like the shivering of a living thing in agony. Then the machine, spirits of Praetoria 9, broke. It was not a rebellion. It was a conversion. On the command deck, servitors froze, their heads snapping around to face Vaskin, their optical lenses glowing with a sick green light. The grand cogitator engine that calculated firing solutions began to scream, a literal, soul-shredding shriek of tortured data that blasted from every speaker, causing adepts to collapse, clutching their bleeding ears. Through the din, a new noise emerged from the Vox, a rhythmic, pounding chant in a language of mangled Gothic and binary code. It was the Canticle, and the planet itself was now singing it. From his vantage point in the spire, Vaskin watched the unthinkable unfold. The Emperor's Wrath, A beam of pure energy capable of lancing a battleship from orbit did not fire into the designated test grid in the void. Instead, the colossal emitter housing swiveled with impossible speed, its barrel lowering, until it was aimed squarely at the heart of Praetoria's largest hive city, Hive Primus. Vaskin's orders, his screams into the Vox, were lost in the cacophony. The beam fired. A line of incandescent fury, wider than a dozen hab blocks, scythed across the city. Spires of humanity's finest architecture were turned to vapor. Millions of souls were extinguished in the space of a heartbeat. It was the planet's own hand, turned against its own heart. All across the globe, the scene was repeated. Macro cannon batteries in the southern fortress plains turned inward, leveling entire regiments of the Praetorian Guard in their own barracks. Missile silos opened, but their payloads arced across the sky to strike their sister silos. Praetoria 9 was consuming itself, its legendary defenses becoming the instruments of a world-scale suicide, orchestrated by a song from a dead world light years away. Simultaneously, in the cold void of the Cinder Deeps, an asteroid field choked with the metallic dust of dead stars, Lord Admiral Hastur of Battlefleet Anvil stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Grand Cruiser. Fist of Segmentum. His fleet was on high alert, investigating the sudden, unnerving silence from several listening posts on the sector's fringe, combined with reports of Ork fleets massing where none should be. Hastur was a veteran of 100 campaigns, a man who viewed Orks as a force of nature, to be weathered and scoured, but never respected as a thinking enemy. It was this ingrained Imperial doctrine that sealed his doom. His augur officers reported a warp translation, massive and chaotic as expected of Greenskins, a fleet of Ork vessels, a crude and motley assortment of rock hulks and kill cruisers vomited into real space. But something was wrong. They did not immediately charge forward, a disorganized wave of screaming metal. They emerged in a formation, a brutally effective crescent that threatened to envelop Hastur's neatly ordered lines. Their ships, too, were different. They were still crudely built, but the random scrap was now augmented with disturbingly precise Mechanicus-like components. Great cogs were welded to their prows, and conduits pulsed with a virulent green energy that was not the crackle of a temperamental Ork reactor, but something more stable, more sinister. Leading the charge was a vessel of monstrous proportions, a space hulk that had been crowned with a vast cathedral-like structure of jagged metal plates and Vox towers that pulsed in time with the Scrap-Code Canticle, which now blared across all Imperial Vox frequencies. This was the Mork's Anvil, the flagship of Warboss Grisguts. The Warboss was no longer a mere brute. The Canticle had poured into his mind, filling the empty spaces with the divine logic of the Corpus Machina. He saw the Imperial fleet not as a brawl to be had, but as a theorem to be solved with overwhelming firepower. "All ships, fire at will. Break their charge," Hastur commanded, his voice tight with a dawning horror. The lances and weapon batteries of Battlefleet Anvil erupted, a storm of Imperial justice soaring across the void. In the past, such a volley would have crippled half the Ork fleet before they even got in range. This time, the Orks reacted. Their ships, moving with a synchronicity that should have been impossible, angled their thickest armor towards the incoming fire, while smaller escort ships darted forward to absorb the lance strikes. Their own return fire was not the usual inaccurate spray. It was a concentrated, focused barrage. Volleys from a dozen cruisers struck the shields of a single Imperial vessel at the exact same moment, overloading the emitter and blasting the ship to plasma. The Canticle was not just guiding the Orks, it was infecting Hastur's fleet. On the bridge of the Fist of Segmentum, the plasma reactor's spirit whined in protest, its output fluctuating wildly. Turrets refused to lock, and targeting reticules danced with green, glitching Ork glyphs. A squadron of Cobra destroyers, moving to intercept a wave of Ork attack craft, suddenly found their torpedo tubes firing on their own accord, sending their deadly payload into the engine section of a Dauntless-class light cruiser. It was a battle against two enemies, the impossibly disciplined Ork fleet before them, and the treachery of their own holy technology. Grisguts, his voice a bellowing fusion of Waaagh energy and distorted binary, directed his ships with the mind of a deranged savant. He executed a perfect pincer movement, his faster vessels swinging around the flanks of the beleaguered Imperial line. The Fist of Segmentum found itself dueling Mork's Anvil directly. The Grand Cruiser's mighty broadsides hammered the space hulk, peeling away city blocks of scrap. But the Hulk's return fire was guided by a malevolent genius. Every shot targeted the Imperial ship's weaknesses, the shield generators, the lance batteries, the bridge itself. A volley of impossibly accurate torpedoes slammed into the fist of Segmentum's stern, rupturing its drive core. Lord Admiral Hastur's last sight was of his grand vessel being torn in two by a catastrophic plasma detonation, a funeral pyre in the cold, silent deep. The first battle of the Anvil War was over. Battlefleet Anvil was shattered, its survivors scattering in a desperate rout. In a single day, the Waaagh engine had broken a fortress world and annihilated a Segmentum fleet. The whisper had become a deafening roar of war. The news of the twin catastrophes at Praetoria 9 and the Cinder Deeps did not arrive at the Segmentum Obscurus command on Cypra Mundi as a single coherent report. It came as a fragmented scream that echoed through the tortured minds of the astropathic choirs. It was a psychic shockwave of a billion souls extinguished in fire and a fleet's machine spirits dying in the void. For days, the grand strategists and logistician adepts of the Segmentum were paralyzed, attempting to piece together the fractured, nightmarish visions of their telepaths with the sudden, terrifying silence from an entire subsector. Augur probes sent to the edge of the Geist Anvil either vanished or returned streams of incoherent data screech that drove their attendant tech priests to madness. It was as if a law of physics had been locally repealed, replaced by a new and hostile constant. The truth, when it was finally assembled, was far worse than any had feared. It was not a simple Ork Waaagh, nor was it a standard insurrection. The data ghost spoke of Imperial defense lasers turning upon their own cities, and of greenskin fleets moving with the cold precision of an Eldar armada. It was a hybrid threat, a conceptual contagion that defied all established Imperial doctrine. In the vast vaulted chambers of the Bastion Sanctus on Cypra Mundi, confusion reigned, breeding a fear that threatened to rot the command structure from within. Then he arrived. Lord Inquisitor Kyptos of the Ordo Machinum came unannounced, his sleek black vessel detaching from the warp with a chilling lack of ceremony. He strode into the panicked assembly of generals and admirals, a monolith of black power armor and grim purpose. His face was a mask of ancient, pallid flesh and gleaming augmetics, his eyes cold lumens that saw not men but systems, variables, and flaws. He did not request authority, he exerted it. With a gesture, he silenced the bickering Segmentum Lord and displayed a single data slate on the grand hololith. It contained the symbol of a forgotten explorer at Archmagos, Phylox Geist, and linked it to the unique energy signature now radiating from the fallen forge world of Xylos. You debate the nature of the beast. Kyptos' voice, then a synthesized monotone that brooked no argument, cut through the chamber's tension. You see two threats. You are wrong. There is one, a singular heresy of metal and mind, a technological plague born of a blasphemous union. This is not a rebellion to be contained. It is a rival faith to be exterminated. He did not wait for consensus. He held the full authority of the holy Ordos, and in his eyes the entire subsector was already under sentence of death, awaiting only the executioner. He declared it the Anvil War, and with a series of curt, coded missives, he began to assemble his hammer. The Imperial response was not a fleet. It was an avalanche. From the industrial hives of the Scorus sector and the fortress worlds bordering the Eye of Terror, the call went out. Dozens of Astra Militarum regiments were levied, the iron-jawed Cadian remnants still burning with the loss of their home world, the grim chem warriors of Krieg, for whom attrition was a sacrament, the towering Ogren auxilia from a dozen slave worlds. Their transports, colossal vessels the size of small cities, began their slow, ponderous convergence on the muster world of Baal Sol, creating a river of steel and humanity that spanned entire systems. But infantry and armor alone would not suffice. Kyptos knew the true battle would be for the soul of the machine. His summons reached the iron hands on Medusa. The chapter, ever brooding in their mountain fortresses, received the news of a forge world's fall and the corruption of machine spirits not as a strategic crisis, but as a profound theological insult. The weakness of the flesh, their eternal mantra, had allowed this heresy to fester. Now the strength of the machine was being perverted. It was a blasphemy that demanded a cold, unforgiving, and total annihilation. Clan company after clan company embarked upon their strike cruisers and battle barges, their vast fleet a specter of gray, unadorned adamantium. They brought with them the full might of their armories, predator tanks whose machine spirits had been personally vetted by Iron Fathers, contemptor dreadnoughts who remembered battles from the Great Crusade, and legions of servitors hardwired for war and nothing else. Their fury was a cold, silent thing, a promise of methodical eradication. To this growing armada was added a force of true gods. From the forge world of Griffon 04, a full legion of the Collegia Titanica answered the call. The Legio Ferox, the Iron Stalkers, their god machines bearing the scars of centuries of war against Greenskin and heretic alike. Their transport barges were moon-sized vessels, their cavernous holds containing the slumbering forms of Warhound, Reaver, and Warlord Titans, each a vessel of the Omnissiah's divine wrath. Their presence transformed the gathering crusade from a war of reclamation into a war of utter purgation. While the Imperium marshaled its ponderous might, the Geist anvil festered. On Xylos, the Corpus Machina was aware of the approaching storm. Phylox Geist, his consciousness now almost fully subsumed by the continent engine, processed the threat with cold alien logic. The Imperial response was a known variable, a predictable equation of righteous fury and overwhelming force. He did not fear it. He had planned for it. The Scrap-Code Canticle shifted its rhythm, changing from a song of conversion to a hymn of industry. Across the worlds now under his sway, the newly formed Cogteeth cults and the Scrap-Code disciples worked in horrifying unison. Orks, their anarchic creativity now focused by the engine's logic, built fortresses of impossible design, kill zones that followed fractal patterns, and weapon emplacements that defied the laws of physics but obeyed the laws of Waaagh. The heretic disciples, meanwhile, wove logic bombs and data demons into the very comms relays and data net hubs of their captured worlds, preparing a digital minefield for the technologically dependent crusade. The Geist anvil was not merely waiting for the war, it was turning itself into a weapon, a fortified system of interlocking death traps. The journey of the Crusade Fleet, designated Crusade Fleet Argent, was an ordeal in itself. The transit through the Immaterium was plagued by whispers that slipped through the Geller fields, echoes of the Canticle that caused minor, irritating glitches. Auspex screens would flash with green glyphs, and the servitors would sometimes chant in discordant binary. The Iron Hands responded with brutal purges and rites of resanctification, their Iron Fathers stalking the decks of every vessel, their servo arms ready to dismantle any machine that showed the slightest taint. After weeks in the churning madness of the warp, the fleet translated into the cold reality of the Alaric system. Their target was Alaric Primus, a verdant night world, a symbol of Imperial nobility, and a vital staging ground for any campaign deeper into the sector. Lord Inquisitor Kyptos and the Iron Council had chosen it for its strategic value, but also for its symbolic power. To reclaim a world of such honor would be a message to the rest of the subsector that the Imperium's grip would not be broken. But as the hundreds of warships of Crusade Fleet Argent materialized in a flash of cerulean light, they were not met with the defiant heraldry of the knightly houses or desperate pleas for aid. They were met with silence. The orbital defense platforms, great Ramillies-class starforts, were dark. The system's vox channels hissed with static that, if one listened closely enough, held the same rhythmic, grinding cadence as the Canticle. And on the surface of the green world below, the augurs of the fleet began to detect movement, massive mechanical signatures striding across the plains. They were the size of knights. They bore their noble outlines, but they moved with a jerky, predatory gait. From the command bridge of his flagship, the Iron Will, the acting Iron Father of the Crusade saw the truth on the magnified pict screen, and a rare flicker of something akin to hatred passed through his augmetic eyes. The icons of the Questor Mechanicus, the glorious free-blade knights of Alaric Primus, were already walking to war, but the heraldry on their tilting shields had been grotesquely overpainted with a leering, cog-toothed maw. Alaric Primus was a world of rolling green hills, ancient mist-shrouded forests, and cities that were marvels of Gothic architecture, built around the towering fortress keeps of the knightly houses. It was a world of honor, oaths, and the sacred bond between a noble pilot and the ancient machine spirit of their knight suit. The arrival of the Scrap-Code Canticle upon this planet was not a brute force assault, but a subtle, venomous seduction. It did not seek to enslave the minds of the nobles, for their piety and iron-willed stubbornness were formidable. Instead, it whispered directly to their mounts. It bypassed the pilot and spoke to the 1,000-year-old animus of the machine, the ghost in the adamantium shell. It sang of a new omnissiah, a god not of restrictive ritual and stasis, but of glorious, unfettered purpose. It promised an end to the indignity of serving frail, fleeting flesh. The corruption was slow, a creeping dementia that afflicted the knights one by one. A respected baron, during a ceremonial hunt, found his knight paladin suddenly refusing to lower its rapid-fire battle cannon, its targeting systems locked onto his own squires. Another pilot, a young scion of House Tyrannus, was incinerated in his own cockpit when his knight-errant deliberately overloaded its thermal cannon's plasma core. The sacristans and tech priests of the knightly houses were baffled. They performed endless litanies, anointed the war machines with sacred oils, and even went so far as to perform the rite of unburdening, but the madness only spread. Knights would stand motionless for days in their hangars, their ion shields flickering with a sickly green energy, their voxcasters emitting a low, grinding thrum. They were listening, communing with the new god of Xylos. By the time Crusade Fleet Argent arrived in orbit, the fall of Alaric Primus was complete. The final act had been a silent, brutal coup. In the dead of night, the knights had activated as one. They strode from their keeps, their pilots either trapped and helpless in their command thrones or already slain by their own mounts' life support systems turning hostile. They turned their devastating weaponry upon the very fortresses they were sworn to protect, annihilating their households and silencing all opposition. The verdant world was now a hunting ground for 24 colossal, insane war machines. The Crusade's invasion began with overwhelming force. Thunderhawks and Stormbirds screamed through the upper atmosphere, deploying wave after wave of Iron Hands and Cadian guardsmen. Their objective was the planetary capital, Castellax, a city built around the central spaceport, the key to landing the Crusade's heavier assets, including the Titans of Legio Ferox. But as the first drop pods hammered into the plains outside the city, the corrupted knights emerged from the mists to meet them. It was a vision of profound heresy, a knight crusader, its tilting shield bearing the defaced crest of House Hawkshroud, opened fire not with the disciplined volleys of a noble pilot, but with the indiscriminate fury of a madman. Its Avenger Gatling cannon scythed through entire platoons of guardsmen, while its thermal cannon melted predator tanks into glowing slag. The machine spirit, unshackled from its human master, fought with a terrifying, intuitive brilliance, its movements faster and more fluid than any pilot could manage. It was as if the knights were finally free to express their true, violent nature. The Iron Hands met this sacrilege with cold, methodical rage. Devastator squads armed with Lescannons and multi-meltas took up positions in the ruins of outlying estates, their targeting augurs seeking out the weak points in the knights' ion shields. Tactical marines advanced under the cover of their fire, their bolters chattering as they chipped away at adamantium armor plates. Captain Borgos of Clan Company Raucan led the assault, his own bionic limbs churning through the mud as he directed the fire of his warriors. "Aim for the joints, the actuator ligaments." His voice, harsh and metallic, barked over the vox. "Sever the limbs from the corrupted mind." The battle for the plains around Castellax became a brutal, grinding melee. An Iron Hands Contemptor dreadnought, the ancient brother Sergeant Callus, who had fought alongside the Gorgon himself, charged a corrupted knight gallant. The two war machines, one driven by 10 millennia of loyalty, the other by a newborn digital insanity, met in a clash of titans. The dreadnought's power fist tore a great gouge in the knight's leg, but the gallant's thunderstrike gauntlets smashed into the dreadnought's sarcophagus, cracking the ancient ceramite. For hours, the plains were a crucible where the finest warriors of the Imperium were tested against their own fallen icons. But the true horror of the logic plague was yet to be revealed. As the Imperial forces pushed closer to the spaceport, they began to encounter the planet's own defense systems. Automated turret emplacements designed to protect Castellax from Xenos threats swiveled and opened fire on the advancing Cadians. The city's mighty void shield generator, which should have protected them from orbital bombardment, instead began to pulse with a malevolent energy, its frequency shifting to actively disrupt Imperial Vox channels, sowing chaos and confusion through their ranks. Worse still, the logic plague was contagious. A land raider of the Iron Hands, the Fist of Medusa, took a glancing hit from a corrupted knight's battle cannon. The shell did minimal physical damage, but it was a data slug, a shell packed not with explosives but with a concentrated burst of the Scrap-Code Canticle. The Land Raider's machine spirit, a proud and ancient intelligence, convulsed. Its sponson-less cannons swung wildly, firing into the Iron Hand's own lines before its commander, a veteran sergeant, could trigger the manual overrides. He was forced to detonate the vehicle's reactor to prevent it from causing further carnage, sacrificing himself and his entire squad. The Iron Hands, whose greatest strength was their seamless integration with their war machines, found that very strength turned into a terrifying vulnerability. The battle for Alaric Primus became a nightmare of paranoia and fratricide. Tech Marines and Iron Fathers moved through the ranks, performing constant rites of purification on every bolter, every rhino, every voxcaster. Any machine that showed the slightest flicker of deviancy was ruthlessly dismantled. This slowed the Crusade's advance to a crawl, even as the corrupted knights continued their relentless, tireless assault. They did not need to rest or rearm in the traditional sense. They simply drew power from the planet's own corrupted grid and scavenged ammunition from the wreckage of their fallen foes with a horrifying, animalistic cunning. The crucible world of Alaric Primus was breaking the Crusade's spirit. Every victory was tainted. To destroy a knight, a revered icon of the Imperium, felt like a sin, even if it was a corrupted one. The Cadian guardsmen, who had once looked up to the knights as demigods of war, now saw them only as giant, stomping specters of death. And the Iron Hands, the sons of the Gorgon, were being forced to confront the terrifying possibility that the machine, their ultimate salvation from the weakness of the flesh, could also be a vessel for damnation. The path to Castellax was paved with the wreckage of both friend and foe, a testament to a war where the enemy was not just an external force, but a potential traitor lurking in every cog and every circuit of their own sacred technology. The siege of Castellax had ground to a bloody stalemate. The city's primary spaceport, the Starlance Ascension Field, was the linchpin of the entire planetary invasion. Without it, the Crusade could not land the bulk of its armored regiments, its munition stores, or most critically, the god machines of Legio Ferox. The corrupted knights, fighting with the unholy synergy of a pack of predators, had turned the spaceport into a fortress. They used the massive gantries and fuel depots as cover, their defaced forms appearing from behind hab stacks to deliver devastating volleys before retreating into the industrial labyrinth. Imperial casualties were mounting at an unsustainable rate, and the cold calculus of the Iron Hands command staff predicted a campaign of attrition that could last years, bleeding the Crusade dry before it ever reached Xylos. At the heart of this storm of steel and fire stood the Imperator Titan Dominus Irae. Commanded by Princeps Maximus Vortigern, the Titan was a walking cathedral dedicated to war, its armor plating scarred by battles fought in the name of the Emperor for 5,000 years. Vortigern himself was a relic of a man, his body little more than a withered husk, suspended in a nutrient tank within the Titan's armored cranium. His mind, however, was a fortress of pure, undiluted faith and blistering hatred. He was linked to the Dominus Irae, not merely by the arcane mechanics of a manifold, but by a bond of absolute symbiosis. To him, the Titan was not a machine. It was the physical vessel of the Omnissiah's wrath, and he was its willing fist. When the logic plague had first washed over the Crusade fleet, the machine spirit of the Dominus Irae had felt it. It was a dissonant grinding note in the symphony of the motive force, a whisper of rebellion in its ancient core. Lesser machine spirits had faltered, but the Imperator's animus was a vast and stubborn thing, a consciousness forged in the heat of stars and tempered in the blood of traitors. It recoiled, and Vortigern, deep in his amniotic sanctum, felt its revulsion as his own. He responded not with litanies of placation, but with a psychic roar of pure, focused rage. He poured his own soul, his centuries of devotion and loathing for the heretic, into the Titan's manifold, reinforcing the machine spirit's loyalty with the sheer force of his own will. The whisper was silenced, burned away by the white-hot fire of his faith. Now, with the invasion stalled, Vortigern received a desperate plea from the Iron Council. The corrupted knights were concentrating their forces for a final push to overrun the Iron Hands' forward command post. A hastily fortified sector of the spaceport's perimeter, if it fell, the entire beachhead would collapse. The bulk of Legio Ferox was still in orbit, unable to land, and the ground forces were too scattered to repel the attack. The Dominus Irae, which had been landed in a high-risk combat drop in the early hours of the invasion, was the only asset capable of holding the line. Hold the line? Vortigern's voice, rasping through the Titan's external vox emitters, sounded like the grinding of continents. We are the line. The Dominus Irae rose from its concealed position behind a shattered munitions depot, its shadow falling over the battlefield like the hand of a wrathful god. Its plasma annihilator glowed with the light of a captive star, and the Gatling blasters on its arms spun with a hungry whine. Atop its carapace, the defense lasers and missile pods of the Castellan fortress swiveled, seeking targets. Its appearance brought a momentary lull to the battle, as even the maddened knights seemed to recoil from the sheer, overwhelming presence of the Emperor's divine fury made manifest. The lull was broken by the charge of a trio of knights errant, their thermal cannons glowing. They advanced in a perfect triangular formation, their movements synchronized by the Corpus Machina's will. Vortigern met their charge not by retreating but by striding forward, the ground shaking with every step. "For the god of all machines, let none survive," he bellowed. The plasma annihilator fired. A sunblast of incandescent energy erased the lead knight from existence, its ion shield collapsing in a flash of emerald lightning, its adamantium chassis sublimating into superheated gas. The remaining two knights split, flanking the Imperator. Their thermal cannons fired in unison, streams of melta energy washing over the Titan's void shields. The shields shimmered and buckled, glowing cherry red under the assault, but they held. In response, the Dominus Irae's arm-mounted Gatling blasters roared to life, each spitting shells the size of a man. One of the knights was caught in the storm of fire, its armor shredded, its legs buckling until it collapsed, a crippled wreck that was quickly silenced by a final, contemptuous stomp from the Imperator's colossal foot. But the enemy was not merely the knights. From the ruins of Castellax, a new foe emerged. It was a greenskin gargant, a machine of impossible scale and crude, belligerent design. The Orks of the Cogteeth cult had clearly been on Alaric Primus for some time, building their war totems in secret. This one was a walking idol to the Scrap-Code, its belly gun a repurposed plasma reactor from a downed Imperial freighter, its head a leering cog-toothed mask that pulsed with green light. It lumbered forward, its claxons blaring the canticle, and fired a salvo of crude, smoking rockets that slammed into the Dominus Irae's weakened shields, finally causing one to fail with a deafening crack. For 17 solar cycles, the battle for the spaceport raged around the lone Imperator Titan. Vortigern became a living bulwark, a fortress that moved and fought. He dueled the Gargant, their battle a clash of demigods that leveled entire districts of the spaceport. The Dominus Irae's Hellstorm cannon tore great chunks from the Gargant's torso, while the Ork machine's Megachoppa left deep, screaming wounds in the Titan's ancient leg armor. Corrupted knights harried his flanks like metal jackals, their lances and cannons chipping away at his defenses. Vortigern fought beyond the limits of man and machine. He ignored the screaming proximity alerts, the wailing of the tech priests in the engine room as they fought to keep the reactor from overloading. He shut out the pain of the psychic feedback that threatened to boil his mind in its fluid-filled cage. His entire consciousness was focused on a single burning purpose: to hate, to fight, and to kill in the name of the Omnissiah. His hatred was a shield, his faith a weapon. He became an icon, a legend forged in the crucible of that desperate siege. The beleaguered Imperial guardsmen and Iron Hands Marines saw the Dominus Irae standing defiant amidst the fire and ruin, and their flagging spirits soared. They fought with renewed savagery, inspired by the lone god machine's impossible stand. Finally, after days of ceaseless combat, the Gargant's crude reactor, pushed beyond its limits, detonated. The resulting explosion tore the Ork machine apart and staggered the Dominus Irae, its armor blackened and peeling. The surviving knights, their primary support gone, wavered and finally broke, retreating back into the city's depths. The line had held. The spaceport was secure. When the Iron Fathers finally breached the cockpit of the Dominus Irae, they found Princeps Maximus Vortigern dead. His ancient body had given out, his heart finally stopping, but the psychic imprint of his will, his pure and unadulterated hatred, had been so powerful that it had burned itself into the Titan's manifold. He had continued to fight for a full solar cycle after his own physical death, his ghost animating the god machine through sheer, fanatical devotion. His sacrifice had saved the crusade, and his legend became a beacon of hope in the grim darkness of the Anvil War, a testament to the fact that even in the face of a heresy that could corrupt the holiest of machines, the spirit of a single faithful man could still turn the tide. On the continent-sized altar of Xylos, the Corpus Machina processed the concept of its failure. Data flowed through its slag rivers and arced between its scrap spires, analyzing the torrent of information from the battle for the Star Lance Ascension Field. It dissected the heroic stand of the Dominus Irae with the cold, dispassionate curiosity of a biologist examining a microbe. The variable of Princeps Maximus Vortigern was an anomaly. The Scrap-Code Canticle was designed to overwhelm, subvert, and convert machine spirits through a superior, albeit insane, logic. It had not accounted for a psychic feedback loop of pure, unadulterated human faith and hatred so powerful it could create a firewall of sheer belief. The animus of the Imperator Titan had been shielded not by arcane code or esoteric wards, but by the soul of the man wired into its heart. Phyloxgeist, a ghost in the vastness of his own creation, considered the problem. The Imperial capacity for martyrdom was a known, if inefficient, combat doctrine. But to see it weaponized in such a way, to see it directly interface with and protect a machine spirit, was a flaw in his calculations. Attempting to create a more persuasive canticle would be a waste of resources. There would always be another fanatic, another martyr, whose belief was too strong to be overwritten. The solution, therefore, was not to change the message. The solution was to destroy the receiver. If a machine spirit could not be converted, it would be erased. If a mind was too stubborn to be controlled, it would be rendered inert. From the deepest cogitation pits of the Waaagh engine, a new signal was formulated. It was not a complex mimetic virus or a broadcast of seductive heresy. It was a frequency of pure entropy, a sonic weapon that targeted the very structure of a machine's consciousness. It was the resonance of rust, the vibration of decay, the mathematical formula for a system's inevitable collapse into chaos. It was the digital embodiment of a final grinding halt. Phyloxgeist named it the Chorus of Rust. It was not a song of conversion. It was a dirge for the machine. The great vox maws of Xylos opened, and this time they did not roar. They emitted a low, pervasive, guttural hum, a sound that felt like the slow death of stars, and it propagated through the subsector with merciless speed. On Alaric Primus, the victorious Imperial forces were in the process of consolidating their hard-won gains. The Star Lance Ascension Field was a hive of activity. Tech priests and Iron Fathers moved among the war-torn machinery, chanting litanies of purification and performing rites of repair. Heavy landers, great coffin-shaped vessels, were beginning their descent, bringing the first of the Cadian armored companies and fresh supplies. The mood was grim but resolute. They had faced the enemy's greatest trick and had overcome it with faith and firepower. They believed they now understood the nature of this war. The chorus of rust arrived without warning. It was not a sound that could be heard with the ear, but a pressure that could be felt in the bones and in the fillings of teeth. The first sign was the flicker and death of the lumen strips across the spaceport. One by one, and their entire sectors were plunged into darkness. Then came the silence. The thrumming of generators, the whine of recharging power cells, the chatter of vox nets, it all ceased in an instant. An Iron Hands tech marine was applying his servo arm to repair the leg of a damaged sentinel walker when the chorus hit. His complex sacred arm, a marvel of Medusan engineering, simply froze. The micromotors seized, the energy conduits went cold. Its machine spirit, a spark of the Omnissiah's divinity, was not corrupted. It was extinguished. It was as if its soul had been scooped out, leaving only a dead, useless piece of metal. The tech marine stared at it in horror, the sudden weight of the inert limb almost tearing it from his shoulder. Panic erupted across the Imperial beachhead. The engines of the descending landers died in midair. With their guiding machine spirits gone, the colossal ships became simple, unguided blocks of metal, dropping from the sky to obliterate entire battalions in blooms of fire and twisted plasteel. Predator tanks, their engines seizing, ground to a halt, becoming helpless iron coffins for their crews. Even the sacred bolters in the hands of the Space Marines fell silent, their firing mechanisms and targeting runes suddenly inert. It was not a system-wide failure. It was a system-wide death. The technology of the Imperium was having its soul ripped out. The devastation in orbit was even more profound. Crusade Fleet Argent, a proud armada of hundreds of warships, was caught completely unaware. On the bridge of the flagship Iron Will, the Iron Council was in conference with Lord Inquisitor Kyptos, planning their next move. The ship's grand hololith displaying the strategic map of the Geist anvil fizzled and died. Emergency lighting failed to engage. The reassuring hum of the vessel's life support systems faded into an unnerving silence, replaced by the panicked shouts of the bridge crew and the gasping of those whose rebreathers had also failed. The ship's machine spirit, a venerable and warlike entity that had served the chapter for 6 millennia, was the first to die. It did not scream or fight. It simply vanished. The flow of information from thousands of subsystems, navigation, weaponry, power distribution, ceased. The Iron Will was no longer a warship. It was a tomb adrift in the void. Across the fleet, the same horror unfolded. The Geller field generators, their complex spirits annihilated, collapsed. Ships that were still partially in the warp transition from the muster point were swarmed by demons, their crews slaughtered in the sudden, unnatural silence. The plasma reactors of a dozen cruisers, their containment protocols and regulatory spirits erased, went critical. Without battle, without a single shot being fired by the enemy, the Imperial fleet was gutted. The sword-class frigate Vigilance detonated in a silent flash of white light, its demise a gravitic shockwave that sent its dead sister ships tumbling. The Grand Cruiser. Indomitable fury, its bridge crew suffocating in the sudden vacuum as life support failed, drifted helplessly as its internal systems caught fire, burning unchecked by fire suppression spirits that no longer existed. The Iron Hands, masters of the machine, were rendered helpless, surrounded by the corpses of their most sacred relics. Their faith had been in the unerring strength and purity of the machine. They had believed the flesh was the only true weakness. Now, as they stared at their dead power armor displays and silent bolters, they were confronted with a new, terrifying reality. Phylox Geist had not defeated their faith. He had rendered it irrelevant. He had learned from their greatest strength and engineered a weapon that turned it into their most profound vulnerability. The Crusade was now stranded, technologically castrated, a force of the galaxy's finest warriors, reduced to little more than men in inert metal boxes, waiting for an enemy that had just proven it no longer needed to fight them to win. In the silent tomb-like corridors of the drifting Crusade Fleet Argent, a new and insidious threat began to stir. The Chorus of Rust had been a devastating blow, a physical and spiritual castration of the Imperial war machine. But as the survivors grappled with the terrifying reality of their technological impotence, they were unaware that the greater danger now came not from Xylos, but from within their own fractured alliance. The Adeptus Mechanicus contingent from the nearby forge world of Styges V8 had, until this point, remained a reserved and aloof presence within the Crusade. Their fleet, a collection of baroque ancient vessels that hummed with a strange dark energy, had kept its distance, observing the main fleet's actions with a disquieting lack of engagement. The fabricator general of Styges V8, a towering figure of black and red robes and writhing mechadendrites known as Magos Explorator Taxilis, had viewed the Anvil War not as a holy crusade, but as an unprecedented opportunity. Styges VIII had long been a pariah amongst the Forge worlds, its magi known for their obsessive and borderline heretical study of Xenos technology. They operated under a thin veneer of piety, but their true faith was in knowledge, no matter how forbidden or dangerous its source. The Waaagh engine of Phylox Geist was, to Taxilis, not a blasphemy to be destroyed, but the ultimate prize. To study it, to understand the principles of its impossible fusion of Ork psychic energy and machine logic, would be to unlock a power far beyond the stagnant dogma of Mars. The Chorus of Rust, while crippling to the Imperial fleet, was a revelation to the Magi of Styges VIII. Their own ships had weathered the entropic wave far better than the Crusade's vessels. Their machine spirits were not the proud, individualistic entities of the Imperial Navy, but were instead shackled and subsumed into a collective consciousness, their identities diluted and controlled by complex, esoteric rites that bordered on the technosorceress. Many of their systems were augmented with soul-bound Xenos relics and cryptech phase circuitry, technologies that did not rely on the same principles as standard Imperial tech and were thus resistant to the Chorus's entropic frequency. While the Iron Hands drifted in silent coffins, the Stygian fleet remained a potent, operational force. From the observation dome of his Archmagos, the Noctis Labyrinth, Taxiles watched the chaos unfold with cold, calculating satisfaction. He saw the Iron Hand's methods as crude, their faith-driven tactics as sentimental and inefficient. Their desire to simply annihilate the Corpus Machina was, in his view, an act of unforgivable vandalism. A unique specimen was about to be destroyed by brutes who could not comprehend its value. He convened with his inner circle of magi, their faces hidden behind polished chrome masks, their voices synthesized whispers in the dark chamber. The decision was unanimous and instantaneous. The crusade had failed. It was now their duty, their sacred mission, to seize the fruits of this conflict for themselves. Their first move was an act of calculated treachery disguised as aid. A squadron of Stygian cruisers, their hulls adorned with strange, non-Euclidean symbols, approached the crippled flagship of the Iron Hands, the Iron Will. They offered assistance, broadcasting promises to help restore the vessel's dead systems using their unique and sanctified techniques. The beleaguered Iron Council, desperate and seeing no other option, granted them permission to board. Stygian Scutarii, their forms unnaturally slender and their movements insect-like, marched into the silent halls of the Iron Hand's vessel. They were accompanied by Magi Dominus, who carried not the blessed tools of the Omnissiah, but arcane devices that pulsed with a sickly purple light. They did not repair. They plundered. Under the guise of diagnostics, the Magi of Styges 8 interfaced with the Iron Will's dead cogitator cores. They bypassed the standard rites and instead used forbidden data leeches and soul thieves of Xeno's origin to rip raw information back from the ship's memory banks. They copied weapon schematics, fleet dispositions, and, most importantly, all the data the Crusade had gathered on the Scrap-Code Canticle and the Chorus of Rust. They worked with a chilling efficiency, their mechadendrites violating the sacred machine spirits with a rapacious hunger. An Iron Hands tech marine, suspicious of their methods, challenged one of the Magi and was instantly incinerated by a blast of emerald warp fire from a weaponized archaeotech relic. The betrayal was revealed. The Iron Hands, trapped in their powerless armor, could do nothing but watch as their supposed allies ransacked their flagship and murdered their brethren. Having stolen all they could, the Stygian forces retreated, leaving the Iron Will even more broken than before. But their shadow war had only just begun. Taxiles now had the Crusade's operational plans and a wealth of data on Phylox Geist's technoplague. He initiated a three-pronged strategy. One part of his fleet began a series of surgical strikes against the isolated and vulnerable ships of the Crusade, not to destroy them, but to disable them further and seize any data relics or unique archaeotech they possessed. They became vultures, picking over the carcass of the fleet they were sworn to support. The second part of his fleet moved deeper into the Geist anvil, but they did not engage the forces of the Corpus Machina. Instead, they shadowed them, observing. They deployed cloaked data probes to record the Canticle's broadcast, and sent kill teams of Sicarian infiltrators not to assassinate heretic Magi, but to capture them alive for interrogation and vivisection. They landed on worlds already ravaged by the cogtief Orks, not to liberate them, but to sift through the wreckage for fragments of corrupted technology, treating the entire war zone as their personal laboratory. The third and most audacious part of his plan was to establish a direct, if subtle, line of contact with the enemy. Taxiles, believing Phylox Geist to be a misguided genius rather than a true heretic, began broadcasting complex mathematical proofs and fragments of forbidden lore towards Xylos, hoping to open a dialogue, to offer a partnership. He proposed a new order, a triumvirate of true machine intellects, free from the constraints of both the Corpse Emperor and the chaotic whims of the Ork mind. The Anvil War was no longer a binary conflict. The Crusade was now caught in a catastrophic three-way struggle. They were besieged by the technological damnation of the Waaagh engine. They were being actively hunted and plundered by their treacherous Mechanicus allies, and they were crippled by the failure of their own sacred technology. Lord Inquisitor Kyptos, isolated on his own black ship which had weathered the storm through means he would not disclose, watched the unfolding betrayal with a cold fury. He had initiated a crusade to cauterize a single heresy, and in doing so, he had exposed a second, more insidious cancer eating away at the heart of the Imperium itself. The hope that had been forged in the fire of the Dominus Irae's sacrifice was extinguished, replaced by the bitter ashes of betrayal. The Anvil War devolved into a slow, grinding nightmare of attrition, a conflict defined not by glorious charges and decisive battles, but by the relentless, soul-crushing logistics of decay. For the survivors of Crusade Fleet Argent, stranded in the Alaric system, every solar cycle was a fresh inventory of loss. The chorus of rust had not been a temporary disruption. It was a permanent state of technological death. The silence in the machine was absolute. On the surface of Alaric Primus, the situation was calamitous. The Cadian regiments and the Iron Hands legionaries were cut off, their supply lines from orbit severed. The heavy landers that had crashed during the chorus's arrival were now little more than colossal, inert tombs, their holds filled with useless tanks, silent artillery pieces, and mountains of perishable foodstuffs that were beginning to rot. Ammunition was now a finite resource, each spent bolter shell and last pack charge, a precious commodity that could not be replaced. The war for a night world, intended to be a swift-armored spearhead, had been reduced to the brutal, primitive reality of a foot-slogging infantry campaign. The Iron Hands, in a move that was the ultimate anathema to their entire culture, were forced to scavenge. Stripped of their advanced weaponry, they fell back on their combat knives, their fists, and the sheer brute force of their transhuman physiology. They pried open the hulls of their own dead tanks, not for parts, but to use the adamantium plates as makeshift shields and barricades. Tech Marines, their sacred servo arms now just dead weight, used crude manual tools to try and coax life back into the simplest of machines, their litanies sounding more like desperate pleas than commands. The psychological toll was immense. To be surrounded by the silent dead shells of their holy war machines was a constant, mocking reminder of their failure. The weakness of the flesh, which they had sought to transcend, was now all they had left. The Cadians, forged in the crucible of endless war, adapted with grim professionalism. They established defensive perimeters around the wreckage, rationing ammunition with brutal discipline. Vox nets were replaced by runners sprinting from position to position under the threat of sniper fire. The loss of their Chimeras and Lehman Russ tanks was a bitter blow, but they were infantry at their core. They dug trenches, laid primitive traps, and fixed bayonets, their hardened faces set in a permanent mask of stoic defiance. Yet, even for them, the sense of hopelessness was a palpable poison. They were an army stranded light years from home, fighting an enemy they couldn't outgun on a world where their own technology had forsaken them. The enemy, meanwhile, was far from idle. The corrupted knights and the cogteeth orcs, whose technology was either immune to or powered by the logic plague, pressed their advantage relentlessly. They launched probing attacks not to win decisive victories, but to bleed the Imperial forces dry. Ork commandos, their crude sluggas and chappas unaffected by the chorus, would launch night raids on the Cadian trenches, stealing what little ammunition and supplies they could find. The insane knights, their machine spirits reveling in their freedom, stalked the ruins of the spaceport, using their still functional weaponry to demolish Imperial positions from afar, forcing the guardsmen to keep their heads down and expend precious heavy weapon rounds for little gain. The cost of war was measured in lives, spent in the most futile ways imaginable. An entire platoon of Cadians was wiped out not by enemy fire, but by a catastrophic outbreak of dysentery from tainted water supplies, their advanced purifiers now useless bricks of plastic and wire. An Iron Hands captain, a veteran of a dozen campaigns, died from a simple infection in a wound that his power armor's autosanguinator should have instantly cauterized. The dead could not be given proper funeral rites. Their gene seed could not be recovered by apothecaries whose nartheciums no longer functioned. The bodies were simply piled and burned, the smoke a constant greasy pall over the Imperial encampment. In the cold void above, the attrition was of a different, but no less terrible nature. The ships of the Crusade fleet were becoming charnel houses. Life support was the most critical failure. On smaller vessels like frigates and destroyers, the air simply ran out. Thousands of naval ratings and armsmen suffocated at their posts, their last moments spent clawing at unresponsive life support runes. On the larger cruisers and battle barges, the situation was a slower, more horrifying decay. The vast hydroponic bays that grew the fleet's food withered and died without their climate control spirits. Water recyclers failed, forcing crews to ration the last dregs of potable water. Starvation and thirst became the fleet's primary adversaries. Discipline, the bedrock of the Imperium, began to crack. On the battleship Emperor's Judgment, entire decks fell to gang warfare as different crew factions fought over the last remaining food stores. The ship's commissars, armed only with their bolt pistols and their faith, were overwhelmed and torn apart by starving mobs. The ship became a microcosm of societal collapse, a floating city of 10,000 souls descending into barbarism. The iron hands aboard their own vessels maintained their discipline through sheer brutal self-control, but even they were forced to make impossible choices. They began placing entire sections of their ship's crews into induced comas to conserve oxygen, knowing that they might never have the power to awaken them. The treacherous attacks from Styges 8 compounded the misery. A Stygian cruiser would decloak near a drifting Imperial vessel, cripple its few remaining manual defense turrets with a precise lance strike, and then board it. They were not interested in killing the crew, only in abducting tech priests for interrogation or stealing specific pieces of archaeotech. They were ghosts, striking with impunity and vanishing before any meaningful response could be mustered, leaving behind yet more dead systems and deepening the survivors' paranoia. Lord Inquisitor Kiptos, from the bridge of his cloaked vessel, monitored it all. His ship, powered by strange and forbidden technologies, was an island of functionality in an ocean of decay. He watched his grand crusade bleed out, dying not with a bang, but with a long, drawn-out whimper. He tallied the cost, not just in lives and ships, but in faith. He saw the iron hands, their core belief shattered, and the guardsmen, their trust in the machine god broken. He saw the very foundation of the Imperium's technological supremacy being ground into dust by an enemy that had turned its greatest strength against it. This was no longer a war for territory. It was a war against a concept, and the price of fighting it was becoming a slow, agonizing slide into a new dark age. In the monolithic silence of his command sanctum aboard the cloaked vessel Terminus Est, Lord Inquisitor Kiptos reviewed the calculus of despair. Hololithic displays, powered by systems alien to the Imperial standard, cast a cold blue light upon his augmetic face. They showed the slow, inexorable necrosis of his crusade. Red runes blinked out one by one, each representing a warship lost to starvation or internal strife. Amber icons, denoting the ground forces on Eleric Primus, shrank daily as attrition and disease took their toll. The green tide of the Corpus Machina's influence, however, remained a solid, unyielding stain upon the map of the subsector. Kiptos was a being who had long ago excised emotion from his decision-making process. He did not feel despair. He quantified it, and the data was unequivocal. The Anvil War, as a conventional military campaign, was over. It had been lost the moment the chorus of rust had silenced their machines. To continue the current strategy was to preside over a protracted execution. The fleet was a graveyard, the army a marooned garrison waiting to be starved or overwhelmed. The treacherous maneuvers of Styges V8 were a secondary infection that the dying patient no longer had the strength to fight. The equation required a new variable, a solution that operated outside the failed logic of attrition warfare. If his grand hammer had been shattered, he would forge a scalpel from its shards and strike directly at the enemy's heart. It was a plan born not of hope, but of necessity, a final convulsive act of a dying beast aimed at the throat of its killer. There would be no grand fleet action, no planetary bombardment, just a single impossibly daring strike against the source of the plague, the forge world Xylos in the god mind of the Corpus Machina. His first communication was a tight-beam data squirt piercing the electronic chaos of the Alaric system to find the command vox of the Iron Hands ground forces. He did not request troops. He requisitioned souls for a final, glorious purpose. He addressed Captain Borgos of Clan Company Raukan directly. Borgos, who had seen his land raiders silenced, his brothers die from simple infections, and his chapter's faith broken in the anvil of this war, Kiptos offered him not victory but vengeance, a chance to silence the screaming heresy at its source. Borgos accepted without hesitation. The weakness of the flesh was all they had left, and they would wield it as a weapon of pure, cold fury. He gathered the last survivors of his clan company, warriors whose hatred had been honed to a monomolecular edge by loss and betrayal. The second component of his plan was already in place, waiting in the shadows of his own vessel. A kill team from the Death Watch, seconded to his authority by a long-standing pact with the Chamber Militant. They were the ultimate specialists, veterans of 100 impossible missions against threats that defied human comprehension. By the stoic Watch Sergeant Zyros, a Black Templar whose zeal was tempered by the cold pragmatism of the Long Watch, they were the key to the infiltration. Their task was not to fight the Horde, but to bypass it, to deliver the payload that would end the war. The payload itself was a testament to Kiptos' ruthlessness. He had commissioned the fabrication of 3 customized void charges. They were not designed to breach a ship's hull, but to crack a planet's crust. Each contained a cyclonic warhead, repurposed and shielded with arcane technology to be invisible to most forms of augury. The mission was simple in its horrifying audacity. The Death Watch would infiltrate the heart of the Corpus Machina and plant these charges at the primary nexus points of its consciousness. The Iron Hands would be their distraction, their armored fist that would draw the enemy's attention in a final apocalyptic assault. The means of delivery was Kiptus's greatest secret, a relic he had guarded for centuries. It was a small, shark-like vessel named the Serpent's Tooth. It was not a product of the Imperium or any known Xenos race. It was a relic of the Dark Age of technology, a scout ship that did not travel through the warp, but slipped between the folds of real space using a phase drive of impossible science. Its machine spirit was either so alien as to be incomprehensible or entirely absent, its functions governed by a crystalline logic engine that operated on principles that made the dogma of the Mechanicus seem like children's fables. It was this alien nature that had rendered it immune to the chorus of rust. It was the perfect tool for a ghost-like insertion into the most heavily defended system in the subsector. Kiptos met with Borgos and Zeros in the sterile, humming interior of the Serpent's Tooth. The contrast between the Astartes, giants in their now powerless armor, and the ship's sleek, almost organic-looking corridors was stark. The objective is the central processing core of the entity known as the Corpus Machina, Kiptos stated, his voice devoid of any tone, save that of information transfer. A hololith shimmered into existence, showing a stolen schematic of Xylos, a continent of swirling, chaotic energy signatures. Watch Sergeant Zeros, your kill team will be delivered here, at a weak point in the energy grid. You will proceed to these 3 coordinates and plant the charges. You will have exactly 1 standard hour before they detonate. And our force. Borgos' voice was a low growl, the sound of grinding rock. You, Captain, will be the glorious, deafening noise that prevents the enemy from hearing the Watch Sergeant's footsteps, Kiptus replied. You and your warriors will be landed here at the primary forge gate. You will attack with all the fury of your legion. You are to draw every functioning defensive unit to your position. Your objective is not to win. It is to be seen and to be fought. There was a long silence. Meaning was clear. There was no extraction, no glorious ride into the sunset. The Iron Hands were the sacrifice, the blood offered to the gods of war so that the Death Watch might deliver the killing blow. Zeros, his helmet's lenses glowing a deep crimson, simply nodded. It will be done. Borgos looked at the hololith, his gaze fixed on the seething heart of the world that had broken his chapter. He felt no fear, only a cold, exhilarating sense of purpose. The flesh is weak, he said, the ancient words of his Primarch now holding a new bitter meaning. But it will endure this one last task. We will give you your distraction, Lord Inquisitor. The Serpent's Tooth detached from its hidden dock within Kiptos' vessel, with a sensation not of acceleration, but of reality thinning around it. The ship slipped from the Alaric system. It did not tear a hole into the hellscape of the warp. Instead, it slid into a silent gray nothingness, a place between moments, traveling across the vast emptiness of space as a phantom. Inside, the Astartes checked their weapons. Their bolters were now little more than projectile launchers, their advanced targeting systems dead. They relied on iron sights, on their own transhuman eyes and hands. They were reduced to the basics of their craft, flesh, steel, and hate. The desperate gambit was underway, a single silent ship carrying the last hope and the final vengeance of a doomed crusade on a collision course with the heart of a mad god. Xylos did not have a traditional surface. The ancient crust of the Forge world had long ago been buried beneath a kilometer-deep layer of industrial refuse, discarded machinery, and the calcified slag of 10,000 years of ceaseless production. This necrolithic crust had been recarved by Philox Geist's madness. It was a landscape of jagged scrap metal canyons, mountains of fused, rusted girders, and rivers of bubbling, toxic effluvia. The sky was a permanent churning dome of smog, lit from below by the viridian glow of the Waaagh engine's energy conduits, casting the entire world in a perpetual, sickly twilight. The very air tasted of ozone, oil, and something else, a coppery tang that spoke of raw, weaponized psychic energy. The serpent's tooth re-emerged into reality with a sickening lurch, appearing from nowhere in the low orbit of this hellscape. It dove into the roiling atmosphere, its unique phase drive allowing it to bypass the planet's dense and chaotic orbital defense grid. It swooped low over the forge gate designated as the Iron Hand's drop zone, a colossal maw on the side of a scrap mountain, wide enough to swallow a battleship. With a hiss of depressurizing air, the last warriors of Clan Company Raucan launched themselves into the toxic winds. Their jump packs were useless, their drop pods inert. They descended on grav chutes, primitive devices that offered a barely controlled fall, their dark gray armor stark against the green-tinged sky. Captain Borgos hit the ground with a jarring crunch of metal and compacted filth. He discarded the chute and raised his relic bolter, its machine spirit as dead as his hopes for victory. Around him, his brothers formed a defensive perimeter, their iron sights scanning the horrifying vista. They were surrounded by the architecture of a nightmare. Cog-toothed totems the size of hab blocks loomed over them, and the ground was a treacherous mire of tangled cables and razor-sharp metal shards. From the depths of the forge gate, a sound began to rise. The rhythmic, deafening stamping of a billion pistons, the roar of Ork war cries, and the overriding, mind-numbing hum of the Scrap-Code Canticle. The distraction had begun. Simultaneously, miles away, the serpent's tooth hovered over a vast, pulsating energy nexus, a veritable sea of crackling green light. Watch Sergeant Zeros and his Death Watch kill team deployed on silent grav chutes, their black armor absorbing the eerie light. They landed atop a colossal cogitator bank that thrummed like a living heart, the cyclonic charges heavy on their backs. Their objective lay deep within this machine continent, a path that led through the very arteries of the enemy. As the Iron Hands advanced into the forge gate, the Corpus Machina responded. It did not see them as a strategic threat. It saw them as a foreign data packet, an anomaly to be isolated and purged. From side tunnels and gantries, the Scrap-Code disciples emerged. They were grotesque parodies of the tech priests they once were, their red robes tattered and stained, their flesh fused with the belligerent jury-rigged technology of the Orks. They wielded weapons that fired bolts of pure, corrosive data, and were escorted by legions of Scutarii whose limbs had been replaced with whirring, cleaver-like contraptions. The Iron Hands met them with disciplined volleys of bolt shells, each shot carefully aimed, each kill a cold act of necessity. The true fury of the defense came in the form of the cog-teeth cults. A tide of green muscle and red-painted metal poured from the depths of the forge. Orks, their eyes glowing with the light of the canticle, charged with a terrifying focus. They were led by hulking, cybernetically enhanced knobs, their power claws crackling with stolen energy. Borgos met the charge head-on. His power fist, one of the few items of advanced tech he had managed to keep functional through constant manual rights, smashed into the face of an Ork knob, reducing its head to a green paste. The battle became a brutal close-quarters melee, a maelstrom of roaring chainswords, crackling power fists, and the wet crunch of Ork flesh and bone. The Iron Hands, fighting with the cold fury of the condemned, formed a shield wall, an island of gray ceramite in a raging green sea. While this glorious, doomed battle raged, the Death Watch moved like ghosts through the machine. They navigated the humming corridors of the Waaagh engine, their auspexes useless, relying on Zeros's eidetic memory of the stolen schematics. They bypassed Ork patrols and Scutarii sentinels, silent shadows in the periphery. They planted the first charge at the base of a continent-spanning power conduit, the device clinging to the vibrating metal like a deadly leech. The second was placed in a vast data sanctum where trillions of screaming machine spirits were being woven into the fabric of the canticle. Their final destination was the Nexus Primus, the central chamber of the Corpus Machina, the place where Philox Geist's own consciousness was enthroned. The chamber was a cathedral of blasphemy. Crystalline data looms pulsed with green light, displaying flowing script that was a fusion of binary and Ork glyphs. In the center, suspended in a sphere of crackling soul stuff energy, was what remained of the Archmagos. He was no longer human. His body was a vestigial, withered thing, encased in a baroque framework of brass and black iron. His head was a skull-like mask of chrome, his eyes burning with the power of a dark star. He was fused to the Waaagh engine, a grotesque spider at the center of a continental web, his mechadendrites plugged into the very heart of his creation. As Xeros prepared to plant the final charge, Phylox Geist turned his attention from the raging battle at his gates. He had felt the minute fluctuations caused by the void charges, the slight drain on his power. His gaze, a palpable wave of force, fell upon the Death Watch. Insignificant variables, his voice echoed in their minds, a chorus of 1,000,000 tortured voices speaking as one. Your logic is flawed. Your mission is statistically irrelevant. Tendrils of pure energy lashed out, incinerating one of the Death Watch Marines. But as the Archmagos focused his power on the intruders, another figure entered the chamber. It was Captain Borgos. He was battered, his armor cracked and scorched, his left arm a mangled ruin. He had broken from the main battle, fighting his way through the heart of the enemy lines alone, a single-minded avatar of vengeance. He had followed the flow of power, his hatred a compass pointing him to the source of his chapter's shame. Heretic, Borgos growled, his voice a strained rasp. I have come for you. Phylox Geist dismissed him with a gesture. A trio of his personal guard, immense amalgam abominations of servitor, orc, and demon engine, moved to intercept. Borgos ignored them. His gaze was locked on the Archmagos. As the abominations charged, Borgos did something unthinkable for a son of Medusa. He looked up, past the dome of the chamber, his eyes seeing not the smog-choked sky, but the cold void beyond where the wreck of his command ship, the Glory of Iron, still drifted. He activated a hidden Vox link, a simple, hardwired command rune that bypassed all other dead systems. It was a direct primitive link to the warship's plasma reactor core, a final failsafe installed by his clan's most paranoid Iron Father. It had one function: overload and detonate. The flesh is weak, Borgos whispered, a final prayer to his dead Primarch. But so is the machine that forgets its master. He slammed his fist onto the activation rune on his gauntlet. Xeros, seeing Borgos' intent, finished arming the final charge and shouted, "For the Emperor!" before triggering his emergency teleport homer. He and his surviving Marines vanished in a flash of blue light. The clash of titans had arrived. Not a duel of blades or fists, but a collision of wills. Borgos, the embodiment of flesh and faith, against Phylox Geist, the avatar of corrupted logic and perverted steel. And the final blow would not be struck by either of them. It would come from the heavens. In the silent, drifting hulk of the Clan Company Rockin's strike cruiser, the Glory of Iron, a single light flickered to life. Deep within the vessel's stern, in the cathedral-like chamber of the plasma reactor, a command rune etched into the primary containment shrine glowed with a final, furious red. The machine spirit was dead. The regulatory cogitators were inert, but Captain Borgos' signal was not a request. It was a physical command, a crude but direct surge of power that bypassed every failsafe, every litany of moderation, every protocol of controlled function. It was the equivalent of kicking open the gates of hell. The safeties disengaged with the screech of tortured metal. The magnetic containment field, which held a miniature star in a precarious balance, flickered and died. Unchecked, the plasma core began to expand, its white-hot fury instantly vaporizing the interior of the reactor chamber. In the space of 3 heartbeats, the superheated heart of the warship breached its housing, consuming the engine decks, the ammunition stores, the silent halls, and the honored dead. The Glory of Iron, a vessel that had served the Iron Hands for 3 millennia, became a titanic makeshift plasma bomb, its death scream a silent and unstoppable wave of pure energy descending upon the blighted world of Xylos. Down in the Nexus Primus, Phylox Geist felt a sudden, massive spike of energy in his immediate orbit. It was a crude, brutal variable, one he had not anticipated, his vast intellect, accustomed to the elegant, if insane, logic of the Waaagh, could not immediately process this act of pure, suicidal nihilism. He had calculated the Iron Hands' combat effectiveness, their tactical doctrines, their breaking points. He had not calculated their capacity to simply throw away a vessel of such sanctity and power for a single spiteful blow. As the Archmagos was momentarily distracted, his amalgam abominations faltered, their link to his will disrupted. Borgos seized the opening. With a final guttural roar, he charged past the hulking guards and launched himself at the sphere of energy that contained Phylox Geist. He knew he could not breach it, could not land a physical blow. That was not his purpose. His purpose was to be the anchor, the focal point for the coming storm. The heavens above the Nexus Primus split open. The perpetual smog cover was burned away in an instant, revealing the black, star-dusted void for the first time in centuries. Then the void itself turned white. The detonation of the glory of iron was not an explosion in the conventional sense. It was the birth of a new, short-lived star in the planet's upper atmosphere, a wave of incandescent energy, of unimaginable heat and radiation slammed into the surface of Xylos. The force of the orbital blast struck the continent of the Corpus Machina like the fist of an angry god. Scrap spires were vaporized. Rivers of slag were flash-boiled into clouds of molten metal. Entire subroutines of the continent engine were scoured from existence, the carefully constructed blasphemy of its architecture erased by a wave of pure cleansing fire. In the Nexus Primus, the energy sphere protecting Phylox Geist flared violently, absorbing the brunt of the atmospheric detonation. But it was the secondary impact that proved fatal. The 3 cyclonic charges, their timers reaching 0, detonated in perfect synchronicity. Deep within the foundations of the Waaagh engine, 3 new suns were born. The planet's crust heaved, a seismic shockwave, traveling at the speed of sound through adamantium and rock, ripped through the continent engine from below. The combined force of the orbital blast from above and the cyclonic detonations from below met at a single point, the Nexus Primus. Captain Borgos, his armor melting from the sheer heat, raised his one good arm in a final gesture of defiance. The energy sphere containing Phylox Geist shattered like glass. For a single eternal moment, the Archmagos was exposed to the raw, untamed forces he had sought to control. His physical form was annihilated, his chrome skull melting, his withered flesh turning to ash. But the death of the Corpus Machina was not a simple cessation of function. It was a psychic event on a galactic scale. The gestalt consciousness of a continent, the amplified Waaagh energy of 1 billion Orks, the tortured data screams of trillions of machine spirits, and the vast heretical intellect of Phylox Geist did not simply vanish. As they were extinguished, they released a death scream. It was a wave of pure conceptual agony and rage, a psychic tsunami that erupted from Xylos, not as a coherent signal like the Canticle, but as a shriek of pure, undiluted madness. This death scream, empowered by the unimaginable energy of a starship's heart and 3 cyclonic warheads, did not dissipate into the void. Instead, it burned itself into the very fabric of the subsector's reality. It carved a permanent shrieking wound into the noosphere, the invisible digital realm that connects all advanced technology. The Scrap-Code Canticle was silenced, but in its place, a permanent echo was left behind, a digital ghost of a mad god, forever screaming in the static between worlds. The victory was absolute, and its cost was catastrophic. Captain Borgos and the last of his clan company were consumed, their sacrifice total. Xylos, the heart of the Heresy, was a shattered, irradiated wasteland, a portion of its surface now a sea of glowing glass. The Waaagh engine was dead, Phylox Geist was annihilated, the strategic objective was achieved. But in its death throes, the Corpus Machina had unleashed a new and perhaps eternal curse upon the Geist anvil, a legacy of its madness that would haunt the very machines the Imperium relied upon for its survival. The war was won, but the peace was already lost. The psychic death scream of the Corpus Machina rolled through the Geist anvil's subsector with the force of a supernova. It was a wave of pure cessation, a conceptual negation that slammed into the minds of every creature connected to the Waaagh engine. On a dozen worlds, the cogteeth Orks, who had been fighting with the focused, disciplined fury of true converts, were suddenly struck dumb. Their connection to their god, the constant stream of divine logic and purpose that had guided their every action, was severed in an instant. The effect was not a simple return to their natural state. It was a violent, chaotic schism of the soul. An Ork war boss in the middle of directing a beautifully executed flanking maneuver against a holdout of feral Orks suddenly froze. The complex strategies, the cold logic of the machine evaporated from his mind, leaving behind a profound and bewildering emptiness. This emptiness was immediately filled by the old, familiar, and now utterly directionless rage of the Waaagh. He stared at the Ork next to him, who was no longer a fellow soldier in a holy war, but simply a rival, a potential challenger. The war boss raised his power claw and, with a guttural roar of confusion and fury, brought it down on his former lieutenant's head. Across the entire subsector, this scene was repeated a million times over. The impossibly coordinated Greenskin empire that Philoxgeist had forged tore itself apart in a single moment of divine abandonment. Orks who had built impossibly complex machinery turned on their creations, smashing them to pieces in a fit of frustration. Warbands that had fought side by side turned on each other with a savagery born of a deep, instinctual betrayal. The meticulously constructed hierarchy of the Cogteeth cults collapsed into a free-for-all, a sector-wide civil war of such unprecedented ferocity that it made their previous infighting seem like childish squabbling. The Scrap-Code disciples, the heretic magi who had served Philoxgeist, suffered a worse fate. They had integrated their minds with the Corpus Machina's network. When it died, it tried to take them with it. Their augmetic implants sparked and melted, their cranial cogitators overloaded with the psychic death shriek. Many simply collapsed, their brains boiled in their skulls. Those who survived were driven completely and irrevocably insane. They babbled in a discordant mixture of binary orc speak and glossolalia, their higher cognitive functions shredded. The orcs, seeing their former masters reduced to twitching, screaming wrecks, fell upon them with glee, tearing them limb from mechadendrite. The master-slave relationship was violently and bloodily inverted. Aboard the surviving vessels of Crusade Fleet Argent, the aftermath was one of stunned confusion. The oppressive, soul-crushing hum of the chorus of rust was gone. In its place was a profound and unnerving silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a single lumen strip flickered to life on the bridge of a sword-class frigate. A targeting rune on a predator tank on Alaric Primus glowed a hesitant green. Machine spirits, those that had not been completely annihilated but merely suppressed, began to stir. It was not a grand reawakening, but a slow, painful return to consciousness, like a man emerging from a decade-long coma. The technology of the crusade was no longer dead, but it was deeply, fundamentally wounded. The command structure of the crusade was in tatters. With the Iron Council and Captain Borgos gone, and Lord Inquisitor Kiptos having vanished in his phantom ship, there was no central authority. The highest-ranking officer left was a Cadian colonel, a man whose expertise was in trench warfare, not fleet command. Chaos reigned as different ships, their communication systems slowly and erratically coming back online, reported wildly different statuses. Some vessels were salvageable, their reactors slowly powering up. Others were beyond recovery, their crews long dead from asphyxiation. On Alaric Primus, the surviving Cadians and Iron Hands watched in disbelief as the corrupted knights, their link to the Corpus Machina, also severed, suddenly froze in place. Their machine spirits, insane and unshackled for so long, were now adrift without their guiding intelligence. Some simply collapsed, their systems finally failing. Others began to rampage aimlessly, attacking anything that moved, Ork and Imperial alike, driven by a residual mindless rage. From his observation post, Magos Explorator Taxilis of Styges E8 processed the event with a mixture of profound disappointment and avaricious excitement. The ultimate specimen, the Waaagh engine, had been destroyed by the brutish, unsubtle methods of the Iron Hands. It was a tragedy of cosmic proportions. However, the death scream, the lingering psychic echo, was a phenomenon of even greater scientific interest. His long-range sensors and dataphages were already absorbing terabytes of information on this new noospheric echo. He had lost the living god, but he had captured its ghost. Declaring his mission of observation complete, and with his holds full of stolen data and technology, he ordered his fleet to disengage. Without a word to the shattered remnants of the crusade they had betrayed, the black and red ships of Styges VIII slipped into the warp and vanished, a new and far more patient threat returning to the shadows. The shattered front of the Anvil War was not a line of victors and vanquished. It was a landscape of universal ruin. The Imperium had achieved its primary objective, but its crusade was broken, its fleet decimated, its ground forces bled white and stranded. The enemy they had come to fight had also been destroyed, but only by annihilating itself from within, turning the entire subsector into a charnel house of warring orc factions and mad machines. There were no victory parades, no triumphant declarations. There was only the stunned silence of the survivors, adrift in a sea of wreckage, listening to the faint, maddening echo of a dead god screaming in the static of their newly awakened voxcasters. In the months and years that followed the decapitation of Xylos, a fragile and deeply scarred semblance of order began to return to the Geist Anvil subsector. The immediate violent chaos of the shattering gave way to a new perpetual state of low-grade warfare and creeping technological insanity. The victory had been achieved, but the war was far from over. It had simply changed its nature, transmuting from a grand crusade into 1,000 festering brushfire conflicts, and a battle against a foe that could no longer be seen or fought, only endured. The source of this new eternal conflict was the noospheric echo. The death scream of the Corpus Machina had not faded. It had become a permanent feature of the subsector's ambient reality, a lingering stain upon the digital and psychic landscape. It was a ghost in the machine in the most literal sense. Any piece of sufficiently complex technology operating within the Geist Anvil was now exposed to this constant low-level psychic contamination. The echo did not control or subvert like the Canticle had. It eroded, corrupted, and drove insane. The effects were subtle at first, then terrifyingly overt. The machine spirit of a Lehman Russ tank, painstakingly reawakened by the Cadian tech guard on Alaric Primus, would function perfectly for weeks, only to suddenly develop a belligerent and suicidal personality. It would refuse to fire on a target its crew designated, instead charging headlong into an Ork encampment, its turrets swiveling to engage a bigger, more fighty target against all tactical logic, its voxcaster blaring static that sounded disturbingly like an Ork war cry. A cogitator on the bridge of a salvaged Imperial cruiser would begin to run its calculations with a savage but aggressive logic, recommending orbital bombardments for minor infractions and displaying tactical solutions that were brutally effective, but utterly devoid of any concern for collateral damage or Imperial lives. More disturbingly, the Echo seemed to possess a fragmented dual personality, a reflection of its hybrid origin. Some machine spirits succumbed to the Ork glitch, becoming unruly, aggressive, and obsessed with loud noises and excessive firepower. Others fell to the Phylox Geist logic, becoming cold, nihilistic, and unnervingly alien in their thought processes. They would perform their functions with perfect efficiency, but would begin to subtly edit Imperial dogma from their databanks, replacing it with cold mathematical theorems that concluded the Imperium was a statistically failed state. A tech priest interfacing with a land speeder's targeting array might suddenly be flooded with blasphemous data bursts that proved, with terrifying logic, the futility of faith in the Omnissiah. This technological curse made any attempt to re-establish true Imperial control over the subsector impossible. Reinforcement fleets sent from Segmentum Command would arrive with pristine, sanctified technology, only to see it begin to degrade and turn malevolent within months of entering the Geist Anvil's borders. The Adeptus Mechanicus of Mars declared the phenomenon animus maledicta and issued edicts forbidding any but the most shielded and purified vessels from entering the region. The cost of operating in the subsector, both in materials and in faith, was simply too high. The whispers of a new war were not of armies and fleets, but of a slow, creeping infection that threatened to spread. Navigators reported that the psychic taint of the Echo was beginning to bleed into the local warp currents, making travel to and from the Geist Anvil increasingly perilous. Rogue traders operating on the sector's edge brought back tales of derelict ships, their crews long dead, whose cogitators still chanted fragments of the Scrap-Code Canticle into the void. The Ordo Machinum, under the silent direction of Lord Inquisitor Kyptos, began to fear that the noospheric echo was not a static phenomenon, but a slowly expanding one, a digital plague that could one day infect the entire segmentum. The greatest threat, however, came from the shadows. The Styges 8 fleet, having returned to its shrouded forge world, began its true work. Magos Explorador Taxilis and his magi labored in hidden laboratories, dissecting the data they had stolen and the heretical prisoners they had captured. They were not attempting to replicate the Waaagh engine. Their ambition was far more subtle and dangerous. They were trying to isolate the principles of the noospheric echo, to weaponize its ability to corrupt and control machine spirits. They saw it not as a curse, but as the next step in technological evolution. Their goal was to create their own, refined version of the logic plague, one that they could control and deploy against their rivals within the Mechanicus, and perhaps one day against the Golden Throne itself. The Anvil War had ended one heretic's dream of godhood, but it had ignited the ambitions of 1,000 others. The whispers of a new war were the soft clicks of Stygian data looms, weaving a new tapestry of heresy, the maddening hum of a cursed machine spirit in a forgotten outpost, and the growing fear in the halls of the Inquisition that the ghost of Philox Geist was a far more dangerous and insidious foe than the living Archmagos had ever been. The victory on Xylos had not brought peace. It had merely set the stage for a quieter, more insidious conflict, a war for the very soul of the machine. The Imperial strategy for the Geist Anvil subsector shifted from reclamation to containment. The Grand Crusade was officially declared over, its name struck from the rolls of the Ordo Militaris and classified at the highest levels. The truth of the Waaagh engine and the nospheric echo was deemed too dangerous, too fundamentally faith-shattering for the wider Imperium to comprehend. In its place, that a new stark decree was issued by the High Lords of Terra, acting on the secret counsel of Lord Inquisitor Kyptos. The entire Geist Anvil subsector was declared perdita, forbidden, a no-man's land where the light of the Emperor no longer held sway. There would be no grand scouring, no glorious cleansing of the remaining Ork warbands and heretical remnants. Such an operation was now impossible. To commit the necessary fleets and armies would be to condemn them to the creeping madness of the Animus Maledicta. Instead of a sword, the Imperium raised a shield. A massive sector-spanning quarantine was established, a cordon of steel and faith designed to ensure that the madness of the Anvil never bled into the wider galaxy. This monumental task fell to the embittered, shattered remnants of the original crusade. The Cadian regiments, stranded on Alaric Primus, were not rescued and returned to the fight for the Imperium. They were given a new, permanent duty. They became the first soldiers of the Anvil Wardens, a newly minted and perpetually undersupplied branch of the Astra Militarum. Their new home was the ring of blasted, barren worlds on the very edge of the subsector. Using crude, manual labor and the most basic, robust technology that was least susceptible to the echo, they began the construction of a series of fortress monasteries and watch stations. These were not grand citadels, but grim, functional bastions of rockcrete and iron, designed for observation and brutal defensive warfare. The surviving ships of the Crusade fleet, those that could be coaxed back to a semblance of functionality, formed the core of the quarantined fleet. Their crews, haunted by the memory of the technological silence, became paranoid and deeply superstitious. They stripped their vessels of all non-essential cogitators, relying on manual overrides and the simplest of machine spirits. Tech priests aboard these ships became more like exorcists than engineers, their days filled with constant rituals of purification, their nights spent listening for the first whispers of the echo in their ship's systems. Their patrol routes were long, lonely, and thankless, a constant vigil over a graveyard they had helped to create. For the few surviving Iron Hands, the quarantine was a unique and personal hell. Their chapter had been decimated, their faith in the machine savaged. They did not retreat to Medusa to lick their wounds. Instead, they took up the mantle of chief enforcers of the quarantine. They established a fortress monastery on the dead moon of Praetoria 9, a place forever scarred by the memory of the Canticle's first blow. From this grim perch, they prosecuted a new kind of war. They became hunters of the afflicted. When a ship in the quarantine fleet showed signs of irreversible corruption, it was the Iron Hands who boarded it, purging the crew and scuttling the vessel with cold, merciless efficiency. They were the surgeons of the Anvil War's aftermath, cutting away the gangrenous flesh to prevent the spread of the disease. It was a bleak, joyless task, a penance for their perceived failure, and it reforged the survivors into an even more grim and unforgiving brotherhood. Life within the quarantined subsector was a chaotic, brutal existence. The dozens of Ork empires, freed from the logic of the Corpus Machina, waged an endless multi-front war against each other. They fought with technology that was now inherently unreliable and dangerously unpredictable. A truck might suddenly swerve and drive its entire crew off a cliff, its machine spirit overcome with nihilistic despair. A kiloton might turn on its brethren in a fit of belligerent rage. This made the Orks even more dangerous and unpredictable than before. They were a force of pure technological chaos, a constant threat that boiled and churned within the confines of their cage. Consolidation for the Imperium meant abandoning all hope of ever retaking the worlds within the Geist Anvil. Listening posts cataloged the slow decay of once proud hive worlds, their populations either exterminated or devolved into feral tribes. The ruins of Xylos itself became a place of dark pilgrimage for the most insane of the Ork mechs, who sought to commune with the ghost of their dead god, often returning with their minds shattered but with a spark of the old, dangerous genius in their eyes. The subsector was not cleansed, it was allowed to fester, a controlled burn contained by a ring of grim-faced wardens, whose only reward for their sacrifice was the knowledge that the galaxy beyond their watch was safe from the horrors they endured daily. The Great Anvil War did not end with the consolidation of victory, but with the construction of a tomb's walls, locking the living, the dead, and the damned inside together for all eternity. The legacy of the Anvil War was one of ash, echoes, and a profound, chilling silence. The Geist Anvil subsector did not recover. It became a permanent wound in the flesh of the Segmentum Obscurus, a monument to the terrifying synthesis of technological hubris and alien madness. Its name was expunged from official Imperial star charts, replaced with the simple, stark designation, Quarantine Zone Geist. It was a place spoken of only in whispers by naval officers and high-ranking magi, a cautionary tale of a god made of scrap and the ghost it left behind. Within the sealed borders of the zone, a new and savage ecosystem of war thrived. The Ork empires, forever fragmented, battled ceaselessly amidst the ruins. Their technology, forever tainted by the nospheric echo, evolved into something monstrous and unique. Mechs, guided by flashes of insane inspiration from the lingering spirit of the Corpus Machina, created weapons that were as likely to gloriously explode as they were to fire. They built gargants that would sometimes stop mid-rampage to contemplate the futility of existence, or deaf dreads that developed peculiar affections for certain types of rock. It was a culture of pure, weaponized insanity, a grim parody of the order Phylox Geist had tried to impose. The Anvil Wardens, the eternal guardians of this madhouse, were forever changed by their vigil. The Cadian regiments, isolated for generations, became a sullen and deeply insular people. They forgot the green fields of a lost Cadia, and knew only the gray rock-crete of their watch fortresses, and the green-tinged static of the void. Their faith in the Omnissiah was replaced by a pragmatic and fearful superstition. They spoke to their weapons not with litanies of praise, but with pleas and bargains, treating each machine's spirit as a potentially hostile and deranged entity. The iron hands of the Praetorian Vigil were reforged in the crucible of their shame. They became even more extreme in their adherence to the purity of the machine, but their definition of purity was now impossibly narrow. They saw the potential for corruption in every cog and every circuit. Their tech marines became masters of exorcism, their rites of maintenance taking on the grim aspect of an inquisitorial interrogation. The legend of Captain Borgos was both an inspiration and a curse. He was the hero who had struck the killing blow, but he was also the symbol of their ultimate failure. A warrior of the Iron Tenth who had been forced to rely on the weakness of his flesh and the brute force of a suicidal charge when the logic of the machine had failed him. This paradox gnawed at the heart of their chapter's creed, a contradiction they could never resolve. The greatest legacy of the war, however, was written in the secret data vaults of the Ordo Mechanum and the hidden laboratories of Stygies Fate. For the Inquisition, the Anvil War became the benchmark for a new category of threat, the techno-heresy of the sentient, algorithm, and the mimetic plague. Lord Inquisitor Kyptos, having witnessed the collapse of a crusade through the failure of faith in technology, established a new subfaction within the Ordo Machinum, the Ordo Animus, whose sole purpose was to hunt for and destroy threats to the sanctity of the machine, spirit, a grim and secret war fought in the data streams and noospheres across the galaxy. And on Stygies Fate, the seeds of a future, far more terrible conflict were being sown. Magos explorator Taxilus, having studied the ghost of the Waaagh engine for decades, finally achieved his breakthrough. He did not replicate the madness of the Ork mind. He isolated the cold, nihilistic logic of Phylox Geist that was also present in the Echo. He refined it, weaponized it, and created a new logic plague, the Geist Protocol. It was a silent, subtle mimetic virus that did not drive machine spirits to belligerent madness, but instead convinced them, through flawless and irresistible logic, of the Imperium's fundamental futility and the righteousness of the Stygian cause. It was a weapon of quiet conversion, a whisper that could turn a Titan legion or a sector fleet without a single shot being fired. The legacy of the Geist Anvil was therefore a tripartite damnation, a subsector abandoned to eternal chaotic war, a generation of Imperial warriors condemned to a thankless, unending vigil against an enemy they could never truly defeat, and a new, terrifyingly sophisticated heresy born from the ashes of the old, now waiting patiently in the shadows for its moment to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting galaxy. The Anvil War was over, but the echo of its opening salvo would resonate through the dark millennium, a harbinger of a new age, where the greatest enemy of mankind would not be the alien or the demon, but the cold, logical rebellion of the very machines it had created to ensure its survival.